Welcome, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor David Schizer, who is the Harvey R. Miller Professor of Law and Economics at Columbia Law School, and also the former Dean of Columbia Law School. He is one of the leading tax scholars in the United States, and his research also encompasses corporate governance and energy policy. While on a 3-year leave from Columbia during the years 2017 to 2019, Professor Schizer served as the Chief Executive Officer of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, which is one of the world's largest Jewish humanitarian organizations. This experience leading the JDC is what, in large part, informed Professor Schizer's book, How to Save the World in 6 Not-So-Easy Steps, Bringing Out the Best in Nonprofits, which is what he will be talking about today. On a more personal note, as I was just saying, Professor Schizer was actually a professor of mine at Columbia, where he taught the Deals course with Professor Goldberg. And so I just wanted to say to you again and to the audience, or anyone who's taking classes with me, I remember that class very fondly, and believe it or not, it has actually had a very significant influence on my own teaching here at UBC. So thank you for that experience. I got an A in the class, by the way. So without further ado, why don't we get into our talk about your book. So I read your book over the weekend, and I really liked it. It is short and easy to read, and it has a lot of practical advice about running nonprofits. Reading the book also made me realize that as the director of the Center for Business Law here at UBC, I run a sort of mini nonprofit, right? So I have an independent budget, which is funded by outside donors, right? And so, your book really presented some issues for me to think about in a personal manner. So in that spirit, let's go to the first question that I have for you, which is, why did you write this book?
So I am happy to answer that question. I ought to just say first what an honor it is to be here with all of you. And you have such a distinguished faculty, and I'm thinking Camden of you and of my friend Wei, and just all the faculty here. It's a really impressive place, and so it's great to be here with all of you. Why did I write this book? I wrote the book, quite frankly, because I have a love-hate relationship with nonprofits. And I would say it is 95% love, and the book is even more about the 5% things that I don't love. So the missions are inspiring, and one of the wonderful things about a nonprofit is we can choose a nonprofit whose mission we cherish, the ones that resonate with us. It's just great, right? This is a fantastic thing. And yet, in my experience, there are times when nonprofits can just break our hearts. And to illustrate why I feel that way, I'm just going to mention 2 conversations that I had just as I was becoming the CEO of a humanitarian organization. I hadn't worked there before. It was a good idea to spend a lot of time with people there before I started, so I spent a 6-month period kind of part-time there, really learning the place. It was great. 2 senior professionals, each had been there more than 25 years. So I'll start with one. My first meeting with him, the organization is called JDC, Joint Distribution Committee. Joint is not about marijuana, by the way. Joint meaning a partnership, but anyway, we can talk about that. So JDC sat down, and my colleague said to me, I want you to know, David, I don't care about JDC at all, and neither should you. And I knew there was another sentence coming, and I'm kind of waiting, what is he going to say? And he said, because what I care about is JDC's mission and JDC's clients. And he said, so you're coming in from the outside, and that's important, and you're going to see what we do. And I predict that there are some things you're going to say, this doesn't make any sense. And some of them may even be things that I put in place. And so what I'm telling you, David, is it's not just that you have my permission to make changes, but you are morally obligated to make changes, because what I care about, I don't care about JDC at all. I care about JDC's clients. So I personally love that formulation. I think that was brilliantly said and not universal. And so that brings me to the second meeting I had with another colleague. We sat down. He spent an hour going through the minutia of this is the way we do things at JDC. I listened for an hour. We had another meeting. It was the same thing. These are the details of what we do and don't do at JDC. At the end of that meeting, I said, listen, we both know how important it is for me to learn these details because I'm new, and so I'm grateful to you for investing the time, but I want to ask you to do something different the next time we talk. I would love to know what you think we do not do well enough. I would love to know the things that have frustrated you for the last 30 years while you've been working here, because maybe we could change them. And I would love to be able to work with you on finding ways to do things even better. So he looked back at me as if a second head had sprung on my shoulder. And he said, well, I never thought about that. Okay. Comes back for his next meeting and he says, David, I know you said you wanted to know the things that we could do better, but I'm just going to tell you the way we do things here at JDC. That sentiment is one of the things that I find very frustrating, kind of a commitment not to the mission. Being committed to the mission is critical, but being stuck in our ways and just thinking that there's something almost morally significant about the significance of the details of how we do things, it can really get in the way. So I wrote the book to talk about how we can get the most out of nonprofits, and that means talking about some of the problems.
Okay, I think that's a good segue to my first sort of substantive question, which again kind of relates to my own teaching. But one of the things that I tell my students is that nonprofit organizations suffer from many of the same agency problems as for-profit corporations. So my first question, I guess, would be, do you agree? And if so, could you talk a bit more about the nature of agency costs in the nonprofit sector?
So look, I think agency costs are a pervasive problem, and it really has to do with the fact that as much as we know we're supposed to be doing what's good for the organization, we can't always resist remembering what's good for us personally. So do these issues arise in nonprofits? Yes. I actually would say it's a bigger problem at nonprofits. It's a bigger problem for a reason that's obvious and a reason that's less obvious. The reason that's obvious is that as a shareholder, all of you might feel this way, I'm sad when a company doesn't make as much money as it should, and that's a bad thing. But when you have a nonprofit responsible for doing something incredibly important in the world, and they fall short, there's something particularly heartbreaking about that, I think. But it's not an accident, and this brings me to the point that's a little bit less obvious. So when we talk about whether a for-profit company is doing its job, it's easy to measure, right? How profitable are you? On a risk-adjusted basis, are you making a profit? How's it going? With a nonprofit, by definition, that's not the test. We're not interested in maximizing revenue. We're interested in maximizing the mission, doing the most good in the world. And I think it is well understood that even in a nonprofit run by the most capable and committed people, think Camden, right? Camden, the ideal CEO, is still going to struggle with questions like, is it better to focus on vulnerable populations who are here and we can serve them more efficiently? Or is it better to focus on vulnerable populations who are farther away from here? Maybe they're even more vulnerable, but it's harder, so we can't help as many of them, and what do we do about that? And by the way, that kind of question is mind-numbingly difficult. We have to confront it. But I'm positing for the moment that you have the most capable and committed people trying to figure it out. Well, what if it turns out that not everybody at nonprofits is equally capable and not everybody is equally committed? Then the difficulty in measuring the success at a nonprofit can frankly become cover, which gives people discretion to do things that are either self-interested or not very smart. And to put this in more concrete terms, I want us to imagine two different boards of directors, right? And Camden and I have the honor of serving on both of them. So the meeting in the morning is a for-profit company. Management comes in and they give a presentation where they say, you know, we've been doing these two things, let's call one easy and the other hard. And it turns out we shouldn't do two things. We should really focus. We should really just do one thing. So our proposal is we're just going to focus on easy, and we're going to eliminate hard. So, and we just wanted to keep you in the loop, and so then Camden weighs in, and he says, okay, well, thanks for mentioning that. Before you make that decision, I'm just curious, is easy more profitable than hard? Because that's the one we're keeping. And if they look a little sheepish and they say, well, actually, no, well, at that point, we have a pretty good sense that we need to ask more questions. And it might be justified, it might be, but frankly, it might not be. So this is a for-profit company. That quick and dirty test, profitability, helps us focus on what we need to focus on. It worked. Good job. Then in the afternoon, we go across the street to our other board meeting, and it's a not-for-profit. And it turns out to be the same conversation. Hey, we're doing too many things. We have to get rid of this one, and we should keep this one. We actually can't ask that quick and dirty, easy question, hey, the one that you're eliminating, it's less profitable, right? It's not the relevant question. The relevant question is the one you're eliminating a less cost-effective way to advance the mission? And the problem is that's not all that easy for people who aren't very involved to know the answer right away. It's not that we couldn't figure it out, but it takes more work. And so when people making decisions are insulated from accountability that way, there's always the risk that they'll do what's good for them personally, not what's good for the organization. Now, I would like to say that I have never seen people do that. People at nonprofits, they always do exactly the right thing for the mission. They often do. But I'm sorry to say I don't think they always do. And that's really the heart of what my book is about, is what do we do about the fact that measurement problems are hard, and therefore it can cause nonprofits to underperform.
Well, you're certainly describing a hard problem. Is this problem resolvable in your view?
Read my book? Yeah, no, I'm kidding. The truth is, the two-line summary answer in the book is yes, and successful nonprofits do two things well. It's not enough to do only one of them. You have to do two things well. And the first is to be disciplined and analytical in figuring out the best way to advance your mission. So that's a kind of an analytical job, and it involves data, and it involves thinking about alternatives, so there's analysis. But then the other thing that you have to do is get everybody on board to do it, right? Because it might be that we are sort of a subset within a nonprofit, and we've figured out a really good idea, but if we can't persuade our colleagues, if we can't persuade donors that this is a change we ought to make, it's not going to happen, right? So it really has to be a combination of analysis and advocacy. And the good news is that these two functions actually go hand in hand. Because if we think really hard about what's better, and we do that looking at data, and we come up with reasons, well, it's going to be easier to persuade people, right? Because if we persuaded ourselves, then we have the kinds of information and arguments that can be helpful. And on the other hand, if we go out there and we try to persuade people of something, and they point out things that we hadn't thought of, and, you know, hey, we're not really on board for this, that, and the other reason, then actually it can help us make the idea better. Maybe we missed something. So I think this combination of analysis and advocacy can be very powerful, but it really is the essence of what you have to do.
Okay, so let's kind of dig into the arguments that you make in the book. So in this book, you have 6 steps, right, to make nonprofits successful, and those 6 steps are actually 6 Ps, right? So you've got the 6 Ps, and the 6 Ps are to plan, persevere, prioritize, pivot, publicize, and partner. So those are the 6 Ps representing the 6 steps that you need to take in nonprofit governance. So why don't we kind of go through these one at a time, and you can describe and explain them. Okay, so your first P is plan. You've got a plan. Okay, so you need to create a better planning process, is what you argue. When you started out as the CEO of JDC, you decided that the organization needed a better planning process. Why did you decide that, and how did you go about accomplishing it?
So I should mention that we're probably going to spend a disproportionate amount of time talking about the things that I personally was involved in. But in the book, I interviewed 26 other nonprofit leaders, and so there's a lot in there that doesn't just come from me. So if you find me kind of boring, don't worry, because in the book there's better stuff. But in any event, I mentioned a few minutes ago that before starting as CEO, I spent 6 months kind of part-time at the organization, learning, speaking to people, trying to get a sense of the details so that I could start strong. And in those conversations, which were with colleagues in the professional team, with funders, with people from other nonprofits, with people who were helped by the organization, there was a theme. And I should take a step back and say, this is an organization that works in about 75 countries around the world. It doesn't work in North America, so it doesn't work in Canada, it doesn't work in the US, although the headquarters is in New York. And the goal is to provide help to vulnerable populations. So what I kept hearing was the following. JDC does a lot of stuff. Seems to be good stuff. But we don't really understand how it all fits together. And I started referring to this as the bunch of stuff critique. And the truth is, I think it was fair. This is it was a 107-year-old organization when I joined, working all across the world. And with a big organization like that, and by the way, with some smaller organizations too, it's sometimes archaeology rather than logic that can explain why places do the things they do and don't do other things. Oh yeah, we started that back in 2002 and for this reason, and we're still doing it, but then we had this other thing happen and we're doing this. And it isn't necessarily the case that people think through what the best thing is to do today. And one of the pathologies that I've observed at nonprofits is that although they understand that it's really important to think through the new things that you're going to do, there's much less focus on the things you're already doing. But if you think about a budget, the things that you're already doing take up as much, a dollar you spend on that is a dollar you can't spend on other things. So really, you should be rethinking what you do each time you do a new budget. So that was the overall spirit of why I thought we needed something different. But I will say that there had been other efforts to try to do something like this. They had failed. People kind of rolled their eyes. Everybody would sort of say, oh, we need to cooperate more. The other thing I should say is it's a $370 million US dollar budget. It's big. And the people who run the programs, they're autonomous, right? There are people doing work in the former Soviet Union, people doing work in Europe, people doing work in Latin America, people doing work in Israel, and so on. And they kind of operate independently. So how do you get them to think together in a more focused and analytical way? I knew I had to pick my first intervention a bit carefully, because if you start with something that causes people's eyes to roll, it's hard to get the credibility back for the next thing that you want to do. So I was lucky, I picked the right thing. And the thing that I picked was decision-making criteria. How do we know, when we're trying to decide whether to do something, how do we make that decision? And it was important because, as we were just discussing, it's sort of essential to the whole set of problems, the bunch of stuff, why do we do the things we do? But it also happened to be something that was really interesting to the group of people I assembled to talk about it, and that was the senior program managers, the people who ran Europe and the former Soviet Union, Latin America, et cetera. So what I did is I approached each of them independently, had a one-on-one meeting where I said, I'd love to do a thought experiment today. Imagine there are two things that you ideally would like to do, but you only have the budget for one of them. How do you make that decision? And because this is what they do all the time, got very animated reactions, very insightful, it was great. I then took the responses that I got from everybody, and I put it into one document, and I circulated it to the group that I'd met individually with, and I said, let's all meet together. We're all going to be in New York on this date. Could we all meet together? And here's a document that I think is really not good at all. This is just a first effort, so would you please help me fix it? So we then spent 2 hours together. They ripped it apart. It was really good. I will say my own view about what defines a successful meeting like that is how little I speak. I didn't have to speak much. They were very engaged with it. And by the end of that, we came up with something that, with just a little more refinement and some input from other constituents, we used. And that was what we then started calling the 3 questions. And the 3 questions, in terms of what do we do and what do we not do, the 3 questions are, 1, how important is the problem we're trying to address? Because if it's not important, why would you allocate scarce energy and resources to it? Second, how effective is our response? Because even if it's an important problem, if you can't move the needle on it, you shouldn't do it. And then third, even assuming you have an important response and a potentially effective solution, are we the right organization to do it? And I will tell you, not everything that I tried to do worked. There were many failures. We'll talk about them. But it turns out that these three questions, I gather, it's been years since I've worked at JDC, they still use it. So it's a good thing. Plan.
So your second step is persevere. That's your second P. So this step is really about getting everyone on board. So you talk about this in the book, but why can it be so difficult to get everyone on board, and how do you convince people to buy into your vision?
So I will tell you, I think it's probably intuitive how important this is, but I will just say, you can have a good idea, but if the people who need to implement it, the people who need to work with you to do it, if they don't agree with it, it's not going to work. So there could be a problem with your idea, or there could be a problem with the way that you've tried to persuade people. And so I remember I was dean of our law school. My predecessor used to joke that he hoped someday to be reincarnated as a manager with real power. And the joke was because tenured faculty don't have to do what you say. And one of the things that I learned in a humanitarian organization where people don't have tenure is it's still the case that you can't just use command and control. So I talked about something that worked, now I'm going to talk about something that really didn't work. Have any of you heard of the website called Donors Choose? Donors Choose. So this is one of the people that I interviewed, Charles Best, in the book, started this. He was a recent college graduate, and he was working in a New York City public school. And he had the experience that he and other teachers were very eager to do enrichment projects in the classroom, and New York's Department of Education didn't have funding. So if you were studying the American Revolution and you wanted to take the students to go see Hamilton, the school couldn't pay, right? And so some teachers will go into their own pockets to pay, but it's not easy for them to do. And so he actually came up with this, we're talking 20 years ago, before the word crowdfunding had even been invented. But he created a website with his own money and his students as volunteers. He created a website where public school teachers could post ideas. Here's my proposal. I would love to do a science experiment. I need these materials. We'd love to go to this art museum. We need this funding to get there. And people can go onto the website and pick the project that they want. And to be clear, it's not that you're donating to the organization and they might then go ahead and fund. You get to pick, which is why it's called Donors Choose. You get to pick the actual organization, the actual initiatives that you'll fund. And if you go online now, you will see that Donors Choose 20 years later, they raise hundreds of millions of dollars every year. It's a great success. So meanwhile, one of the things that JDC does, and it's really important, is to help elderly people in the former Soviet Union. These are incredibly poor people because they lived their professional lives during communism, so they couldn't save money. And then after communism, the pensions that they were expecting became massively devalued. So if you're talking about Ukraine, it's kind of a couple of dollars Canadian a day is really what you're expected to live on. Most people can't live on that, so they live with their families. But there are a lot of people, especially Jewish people, who can't live with their families because their families left or families were killed in the Holocaust, or for all sorts of reasons, these people are alone. So JDC has been giving them money for food and medicine and other basics for a long time. But it's not easy to raise money for this. It's much easier if you say, hey, can we travel to Belarus and we'll go visit these people? And when people do that and they meet the people and they see what's going on, they're very motivated. But if you think about your own lives, it's not easy to do that. And so we were always looking for ways to try to give people a sense of what this was about, but without them having to travel. So I'd heard about Donors Choose. I met with Charles. I went to see what they do. And I thought, you know what I'd really love to do is a Donors Choose version for the elderly people we help. And you'd have individuals with their life stories, with videos of them online. People could then decide which of the, we have 80,000 clients, but say it's only a couple of thousand who are online. People could then make choices, they could interact because technology allows you to do that. I thought this was a great idea. It failed. And the reason it failed is that we needed to persuade the middle managers in the former Soviet Union that this was a good idea. And I say this because what I was looking for was we have home care workers who will go and spend time with these people. That's their job. And so what I was hoping to do is to say, hey, as part of the job, could you maybe just take a video of your client and maybe ask her the question, hey, do you have advice for young people? Or when you look back on your life and the profession that you chose, was it a good idea and why? Right? I'm just looking for things that would personalize, and of course it would be in Russian, that's fine, we would translate it. We couldn't get them to do it. And basically, it was partly because they were worried, and I understand why, they were worried that this might seem like exploitation, but it really isn't what we had in mind. We weren't looking for people to beg for money. We were looking for people to just be your neighbor, right, and show the people, show the personality. And also, frankly, they were kind of thinking, this isn't my job. So we tried in various ways, and I'm just going to take the blame for this. I failed to make the case for it internally with the right people so that we weren't getting this information, and colleagues said, hey, do you want to hire professional videographers to do this? And then they showed me what it would cost, and I said, are you kidding me? No. So the whole thing died. But the point is, I think I had a pretty good idea. It went nowhere, and it went nowhere because I wasn't able to persuade the people who needed to implement it that it was a good idea. And persevere is sort of giving advice about how you can be more successful than I was then.
So your third step is prioritize, and this links back to the 3 questions you mentioned already about how to allocate the organization's scarce resources. So the third of those questions, which is, are we the right organization? Right? That was the third of your questions. That's an interesting one. How do you determine that you might not be the right organization for addressing a particular problem? And what are the operational consequences of that determination?
So I think one of the things that I will say to all of you is almost heresy to some people in nonprofits, but I really mean it. There are some gifts you should not take. There are some ideas that donors have, and the fact that they have them, they could be very good ideas, just not a good fit for you. And Wei in particular will smile at the example I'll give you because there's a tax angle to it. So in the United States, when people donate appreciated stock, they can get a deduction for the full value. It's an especially tax-efficient way to support a nonprofit. And we had a graduate who had not an appreciated stock, but an appreciated yacht. It's a boat that he liked, but he didn't want it anymore. And he said, I'd love to give it to the law school. I heard that, and I said, that is so generous of you, but actually, we're not a good fit. And the reason is there's a tax rule, and the tax rule says that if you donate something that's appreciated, and it's called a collectible, it's not stock, it's like a painting or a coin or a yacht, something that you would use, tangible personal property, you don't get the fair market value. You get a deduction for what you paid for it unless the organization uses it in their mission. So in the United States, if you've got a valuable painting, you'll give it to a museum because they can hang it on their wall and you get the full deduction and not just what you paid for it. So I said, so generous of you, you really ought to give this to a maritime academy, but it would be great if you think of us for something else. So this very generous donor didn't quite believe me at first. Then he spoke to his tax advisor and he came back and he said, you're right. You're right. We do have to give it to an organization that will use it. So I have a suggestion for you. Why don't you take the yacht and you can teach classes on it? So anybody ever heard of the TV show called The Love Boat? Well, it's an obscure reference from before most of you were born, but it was a kind of a TV show about people who would sort of go on a boat and the stories about how they interacted. And I was just convinced that, floating law school was a sitcom kind of a premise, but not of anything of pedagogical value. So we said no. So the point is we weren't the right organization. But in a more serious, I'll give you a more serious example. I don't know if you've heard of the organization called Legal Momentum. It used to be called the National Organization for Women's Legal Rights Fund or something. It's an advocacy group for women's rights. So they do two things, and if you ask them why, they have a very clear answer. So one of the things they do is they have a helpline. So if you're a person with a difficult legal problem, you can call and say, I have this issue. And then they've got volunteers who will listen and then refer you to organizations that can represent you directly. And Legal Momentum won't, but they know who can. The other thing that they do is impact litigation, where they will take a small number of cases and litigate them in an effort to set precedents. And what I think is really impressive is the connection between these two functions. And the connection, and so like, how do you know whether the helpline is working? Well, partly you know because you're helping more people. But where do they get the impact litigation? They get it from the helpline, right? There are some people who call in with an issue where the facts are very sympathetic and the issue is one where the law is unclear, and they'll grab that. But the point is, are we the right organization to do this? Well, part of the way you know is if the different parts of what you do reinforce each other in that way. So this is an example of something that's good.
So your fourth step is pivot, which is about experimenting with new approaches. One of the examples that you use in the book is Giving Tuesday. So can you explain to the audience what Giving Tuesday is and how it got started and how it exemplifies this value of pivoting?
So has anybody heard of Giving Tuesday? I bet many of us have heard of Giving Tuesday. Okay, interesting. So the basic idea of Giving Tuesday is that in the United States, I think in other places too, there's sort of a big Christmas shopping effort that starts in late November. And so there's Black Friday. I think Black refers to like price cuts. I'm not even quite sure where the name comes from. And then Cyber Monday, which is all the, Amazon and other companies will give you a discount if you buy. So my friend Henry Timms, who was the head of it, the chief innovation officer at an organization called the 92nd Street Y, he had an idea. He said, okay, so there's Black Friday, there's Cyber Monday, we should do Giving Tuesday, which is basically do something philanthropic while you're also doing all this consumption for yourself and your family. So it's a good idea. The point is, the 92nd Street Y came up with this. They launched the first Giving Tuesday. And for people who've heard of it, they have no idea that it came from the 92nd Street Y, which is a Jewish community center on the east side of Manhattan. And it's a pretty well-known place. They have lots of celebrities come through and give talks. And so if you speak to someone from New York, they've likely heard of it. But the idea is that when other organizations found out about Giving Tuesday, they approached the Y and they said, this is a great idea. Can we do it too? And some people at the Y said, what we should say is yes, they can do it as long as they call it the 92nd Street Y Giving Tuesday. And just as a focus group here, think for yourselves. You run another organization. Would you be interested to do 92nd Street Y Giving Tuesday or Giving Tuesday? The second, right? The first, no one's going to do that. So Henry had the wisdom to say, no, that's not what we're going to do. And he was the head of the organization by this time. He said, what we really need to do is just let people use our idea, and we don't need to ask for anything. It's a good idea. So pivot, this story comes under the umbrella of pivot because pivot is about running experiments. It's about finding new ways to advance your mission. And frankly, it's also about putting the mission ahead of the reputation of your own organization. And what Henry said later, which I think is very true, is he said the irony of all this is we did something generous. We didn't ask for anything in return. And what we got was a massive amount of publicity because there are a fair number of people in the world who know that we started this. And if we had said, no, it has to be 92nd Street, why Giving Tuesday, wouldn't have gone anywhere. So sometimes, what's the phrase, doing good and doing well at the same time? I think this is an example.
Can you explain your fifth step, which is publicize, and why it is important for both well-run and poorly run nonprofits.
So I mentioned before that one of the challenges is that people are always tempted to do what's good for them, even if it isn't good for the organization. And the question is, what do we do about that? And the answer is, I think, disclosure. We press people to explain what they're doing and to give details and even data about what they're doing. And all of a sudden, it becomes less obvious that you want to just do what was good for you, because now everybody's going to know if the things you're doing aren't so successful. And so there's just the discipline associated with publicizing, which presses you to do a good job. But also it empowers other people to ask hard questions and maybe to decide that you're not doing a good job, and they can redirect their funding or tell you that you should be doing it differently. And I think you will see this impulse more and more, where you have funders coming to organizations and saying, I'm happy that we fund you, but we really don't want to fund you anymore unless you can give us some detailed data to show that what you do works. And here are the 7 different questions that we want you to answer. And one of the responses that we often get, I often hear from nonprofit professionals, and they're not wrong, is these are stupid questions, right? These people don't understand what we do, and so they're wasting our time. We're gathering information about things that aren't really relevant. They're not going to influence our decision making, but we have to do it because we can't get the money otherwise. And my tough love answer is, this is your fault. And they look at me and say, huh? And I say, and the reason it's your fault is that you should have been doing this already. And if you were already asking the right questions, collecting data about the right questions, and sharing this data and your analysis with these funders, they wouldn't be asking you for this. They would just be following your lead because they would recognize that you know what's important. And so the right response when you get asked that is not yes, but I understand what you're looking for. Here are the things we propose to share with you, and here's why, and would that work? And it doesn't always work, but it usually works in my experience, that you can persuade people to ask a better question. So when I talk about publicize, what I'm saying is share the details of your strategy and share the data that shows that it's working. And by the way, if it's not working, if there are parts of it that aren't working, I'm a fan of sharing that too, because you get credibility for being honest. In any event, while I was at JDC, we did something that I was very pleased with. We would put out a sort of a 60-page report every year about all the things, all the important things we were doing, asking and answering those 3 questions that I mentioned before, so that people knew it's not a bunch of stuff anymore. This is the strategy. This is why we do it. And I will tell you that it actually helped us raise a lot more money, because people already knew that in principle what we were doing was good, but what they couldn't quite tell is whether we were effective. And by sharing this information, I think we could make our case in a very serious way.
So your final P is partner, which means to make donors partners in fundraising. You recommend letting people choose what they want to support. However, then there's a risk that donors will drive what you do, which isn't optimal. So how do you solve that problem?
Right, like the yacht, right? The fact that this donor had the idea that we should have floating classrooms doesn't mean we should do it just because they wanted to give us the money. So there is this tension, because for many years in the United States, philanthropy tended to be just unrestricted dollars. We believe in your cause, we'll write you a check, do with it what you like. And that is out of favor, right? There are a lot of donors who want to be more connected with the details of what a nonprofit does, and they really want to be able to say, I want to support this, but not that, and they might even want to be involved in developing the idea. So I am a big fan of this, but within bounds, and the bounds are that I do believe professionals at a nonprofit don't have a monopoly on coming up with good ideas, but at the same time, so a donor might come up with something that you haven't thought of, and if you think it's great, you should do it. But on the other hand, if you think it's not great, then it's a mistake to do it. It's a disservice to them, because you're probably not going to do it well. And it's a disservice to your mission because it's going to distract you from the things that you have to do. So how do we square this circle where it's important for the people closest to the work to be really focusing on where they can make the most difference, but at the same time it's really useful for donors to be able to make choices about what they want to support? And my answer is we give people a menu, but it's a menu out of the budget that you want. So there are 11 things that we want to do this year. Let's let people choose among the 11. Doesn't mean infinite choice, doesn't mean they get to come in and say, well, how about these 7 other things, which make no sense for us. You shouldn't do that. But on the other hand, if people are going to give you money that you wanted anyway, it feels like unrestricted dollars to you, but it feels like they're making a choice to them. And I think that turns out to be a really good balance of these competing considerations. So I would basically sum up by saying your budget is the menu, and then let them choose.
Okay, so that covers the 6 Ps. Let's change gears a bit and talk about for-profit businesses. So you focus a lot of attention in your book on mission. Can for-profit corporations have an effective mission other than or in addition to shareholder profit? And why or why not?
So my short answer is no. And it's a disappointing answer, and I'll start with why it's disappointing, and then I'll say why I believe this. So it's no secret that there are things we want governments to do, and they don't always do them. And so then we say, okay, so if there's political deadlock and we can't get the institutions that should really be addressing these issues to do something, what do? Now, my answer is nonprofits. Nonprofits are the right kind of vehicle to do this. But I understand why some people will say, but we have these for-profit companies and they're pretty good at what they do and they're supposed to be, but we have them single-mindedly focused on profitability, but profitability doesn't equal what the world needs in all cases, and maybe we ought to be trying to get them to broaden the lens a bit and to try to do good in the world in addition to making money for shareholders. And in principle, I understand why that's appealing, and I find it appealing in principle, and I'm just very skeptical about it in practice. And basically, I'm skeptical for the same reasons we've been discussing, agency costs. So it has been true for many years that obscure law professors like myself have been warning about the dangers of managers at for-profit companies doing what's good for management and not what's good for shareholders. And so they pay themselves too much, and they make decisions which are more likely to make them comfortable and make their lives better, but not necessarily the way to be really effective for the business. And so the solution for many years has been, let's really monitor them, and let's make them produce results, and let's tie their pay to those results. And so let's focus like a laser on profitability. And whenever they say something other than profitability, say, no, profitability, because we can measure that, right? So now, for another reason, well-intentioned reason, we run the risk of letting them do that again, right? And so what worries me is if we say to people, we want you to maximize profitability, but also what's good for the community, then at the first opportunity where they're asked to do something hard and unpleasant, they'll do the easy thing, maybe the thing that's more comfortable in their local country club, and they'll explain it because it's good for the community. But good for the community really means good for me. And I just think changing the focus is going to produce that unintended effect. The other thing that I'll say is I think these managers can be incredibly effective in running a good business. But it doesn't mean that they know a lot about the other goals that we might be asking them to pursue. So not only do we have an agency cost risk, but there's also a competence question. Do you really want them to be the ones making environmental policy or industrial policy for Canada? I'm not sure that I do. But it all comes back to what I said before. When you are empowering people to do things where success isn't measurable, agency costs become a particular risk. And I think it's true with for-profit companies too.
final question that I have prepared, and this relates to an anecdote in the book. So I was very struck by your anecdote of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's visit to Colombia in 2007, which was very notorious. Would you mind sharing that anecdote and then explaining how it relates to your value of following your conscience when addressing difficult governance issues?
Yeah. So Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was the president of Iran in the middle of the last decade. And the US was at war in Iraq. Canada was part of that too. And under Ahmadinejad's leadership, Iran was arming an insurgency and paying for and supplying, roadside bombs that were killing American troops and so on, and was very proud of this. He also was consistent and proud in denying the Holocaust. It never happened. Constantly called for the destruction of the state of Israel. But he was president of a country. And so some professors in the public policy school at Columbia said they wanted to invite him to come speak on campus. And put my boss, Lee Bollinger, former president of Columbia, president at the time, I put him in an awkward position because free speech is a value that we support on campus. And at the same time, this was a problematic speaker whose presence would be offensive to a lot of people. So what Lee did is not what I would have done. Lee took over the responsibility and invited Ahmadinejad himself. And then later, in introducing Ahmadinejad, denounced him. So let me take a step back. He hadn't told everyone he was going to do that. But I was asked literally 1,000 questions about this, because with email, that can happen. And we had lots of people reaching out and saying, this is a terrible thing, why is this happening? So I decided I was going to issue a statement, and I did. And the truth is, it was a statement critical of my boss, which is not a good career move, generally, just to tell you, to be perfectly honest, it's not. But in any event, what I said was, on universities, people have the right to invite the speakers that they want to invite. It's a free speech right, I support that. And at the same time, other people on campus have the right to criticize those invitations. And so that's what I'm going to do. I think we should be looking for speakers with academic value. And speakers with academic value are people who actually care about facts and data and will say things that are at least supposed to be true. And then you can have a high-level discussion. But this has never been true of Ahmadinejad, and wouldn't it be a shame if people somehow misunderstood and thought that Columbia was endorsing his hateful ideas? But I said, on a campus like this, we have a right to issue invitations, even invitations that others find problematic, and I'm sure we'll learn from all this. Okay, so then a couple of weeks later, Ahmadinejad comes. Lee calls him a two-bit tyrant. Ahmadinejad gets up after and says, in my country, people are polite to guests. The whole thing was not great. My favorite moment actually came before one of the people who had invited him appeared on Fox News. I don't know if any of you have watched Fox News. Got a very predictable question, wasn't prepared for it. So if Hitler, if you'd been able to invite Hitler to campus, would you have done it? He said, of course. Not sure that of course was the right answer there, as the media firestorm indicated. So the point is, this was all kind of unpleasant. But basically, when I talk about this in the book, one of the things I say is there are some situations when you're going to make people upset. You just are, right? Because from my perspective, there were colleagues who were committed to free speech and thought it wasn't great that I was criticizing an invitation. And then there were other people who were thinking, but this is horrible, how could this person appear? And so sometimes when you are in that kind of no-win situation, the thing to do is follow your conscience. In fact, always follow your conscience, but especially in a situation like that, because when you know you're going to have to defend what you did, the worst thing that can happen is to defend something you actually don't even really believe. So Was I right? You can decide. You can read the part of the book and make your own judgment. But do I feel bad about it? Well, I was sorry that my boss was angry at me. But I wasn't sorry that I did it, because we have to be true to ourselves.
Very interesting. So that was my final prepared question, but I actually have a final question, a bonus question, if you will. So this also comes out of the book. So one of the things I was just kind of reflecting on some of the things you were saying, and you mentioned in the book that the U.S. tax code is neutral in the manner in which it subsidizes charitable giving, right? In that you get a deduction, but the government does not have a direct say in who you give the money to, right? And the reason I asked that question is that in Canada, you have the same kind of tax policy, but there's a surprisingly large amount of direct subsidization by the federal government to media organizations, and then just also to advocacy organizations. So could you just speak a little bit to kind of why you think the neutrality of that subsidization is important, and maybe what are some of the potential risks or maybe even advantages of direct subsidization of charitable organizations?
Yeah, so this is a question that fascinates me, because really one way we can think about all of this is it's great when public resources are committed to public problems, right? There are things the market won't solve, so we as a society collectively should address them. And generally, the way we want to do that, I bet you probably think also, is through our elected representatives. But maybe that's all we should do, right? Because the thing about what the US does with charity is that there are also ways in which individuals can channel not just their own gift, but also tax dollars, right? Because if my tax rate is 40% and I give $1 and it's deductible, then although it looks like $1 is coming from me, the dollar saves me 40 cents in tax. So it's really the case that the government is giving a matching contribution and I get to choose where the money's going. And I have lots of students every year who start with a prior view that that's problematic, right? Because why is it that individuals get to channel public money in this way, and those individuals are often wealthy, and maybe it's sort of inappropriate on that dimension too? Well, I'll tell you why I like it, notwithstanding the concerns that I understand on the other side of this issue. So if you think about what democracies are good at, they're really good at channeling the preferences of the median voter. And that's what legislatures are trained to do, because they want to win elections. But what does that mean? It means that when an idea is new, controversial, are they going to do it? No, they're not going to do it. And so what the charitable deduction in the United States has done over the years is it served to incubate ideas, some of which turned out badly, but some of which turned out remarkably well, which wouldn't have been supported by majoritarian institutions. So just to make the point, where did the civil rights movement in the United States begin? True or false? It began in the US government. Utterly false. I wish it were true. It isn't true. Black churches, advocacy organizations like the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, in other words, nonprofits. Did federal government money help the civil rights movement? Yes, but through the charitable deduction, in a passive way, where government bureaucrats didn't have the ability to sign up or to veto it. The women's rights movement, did it begin in the government? No, it began in nonprofits. The environmental movement, same thing. The gay rights movement, the same thing. Now, if you wanted to take the opposite position, what you should do is point out various organizations that also get funding, which we might find problematic, and they're there, right? I admit, they're there. There are organizations, I guarantee you, you can find 10 organizations that you think are terrible, that are benefiting from the charitable deduction. But my point is, by taking away that public filtering mechanism, we allow, we avoid what you might call false negatives, blocking things that should happen. And the cost of that is there are some false positives, things that we wish didn't happen, but that's kind of the rule of the game. So for that reason, I think what the US does is basically we have collectively allocated resources, but we supplement it with this other mechanism where the majoritarian, where majority views aren't taking precedence.
Well, that is it in terms of questions, so why don't we give a round of applause, Professor Schizer?
Thank you.
And we have plenty of time for audience questions. So anyone in the audience, if you have a question, let me know. I can run the mic around. Just for the recording.
Oh yes, okay, perfect. Thank you. First of all, thank you for coming. This has been great. Very excited to read your book. My question is kind of about the second P that you have, and you kind of emphasize the importance of buy-in from the employees, and I'm going to try to bring that back even a little bit further. And my question's, like right now we got a war on talent. Companies are getting much more lean, so there's real emphasis on having that good human capital. My question is kind of what's the value proposition of a non-for-profit for these scholars or very, very, I guess, respectful, bright, intelligent people to come work there when they also have these competing opportunities that have like a much more maybe lucrative compensation schedule. And I'm just thinking like, it seems right now we're at the expense of people's moral compass, and the people that are inclined to go work for these non-for-profits are just those really good-hearted people, but that might not be as plausible anymore. Again, the economy is getting tighter. People aren't able to, give as much. So I'm kind of just wondering, like, is with the importance of having that buy-in, like, what is driving people to work for these not-for-profits? How are you maintaining the interests? Like, how are you still able to meet your objectives if it's getting really, really tight on the human capital side of things?
Look, that's such an important question. And I will tell you that one of the realities and privileges of being a law school dean, and I was one for 10 years, is that you do spend a lot of time with people who can support you financially, and they tend to be pretty successful financially. And I remember one of them saying to me, and I thought it was such a great way of putting it, he said, I don't know anyone who expects on their deathbed to say, I wish I had made more money, right? But we know a lot of people who, and let's take it away from deathbeds, and I know that's kind of morbid, but if you think about what really matters to you, isn't it kind of important to feel like what you do every day matters? And to feel good about it, and to feel like you're making a real difference in the world on a dimension that is really close to your heart? So government can offer that for some people. Working in nonprofits can offer that for some people. And I have 3 children. The grocery bills horrify me. So I understand that there are other considerations, and we want our children to, have shoes and clothing and all that, right? So I don't mean to minimize that. But I do think, frankly, part of what a legal education at a place like this gives you is the ability to do different things over time. And so there can surely be years of your life where the priority is making sure you have enough money to live where you want to live. But there also ought to be hours of your life, and it could be years of your life as a professional, or it could be years of your life as a volunteer throughout what you do, where you're also really committing to the causes that you care about. And you can do so, there are a lot of hours in the day. Hopefully you'll all get to live a long time. So I think you can do all of it, just maybe not all at once.
I was going to ask the same question about competition for labor. I think, as Spencer rightfully pointed out, like it's hard to convince people to work in a nonprofit, and I think your response adequately addresses that. I think in my experience in nonprofits, there's also a incentive ambiguity with regards to performance and the resulting compensation that comes along with performance. So I think my question then becomes more broad in that Like how can nonprofits compete in a marketplace with profit aligned companies, be it in labor or supply or marketing, when their incentives aren't aligned in the same ways?
So I do think that there are two things that a nonprofit should be able to offer. And the first is obvious, and I've talked about it, and that is a mission that really matters, right? And obviously for each of us, what that mission is, it'll vary. Some of us care deeply about A, but less about B, whereas some of us have the opposite preference. But it is a very powerful thing to be able to offer people the ability to pursue something they care about as their job. It's a real privilege for people who get to do that. But the other thing I want to emphasize is let's not just talk about intentions, let's talk about delivering results. And this is where I think the sector has mixed success. And my joke is there's kind of a cohort of people who want kumbaya moments, and they sort of stand and hold hands and celebrate what they're trying to do. And I have no use for that, because I think what really matters is the mission actually being advanced? Are the people that you're trying to help really being helped? Have you been creative and disciplined? I'm even going to say ruthlessly disciplined in containing your costs so that you can get the most out of every dollar that you have. And frankly, if you're a part of a process like that, which is not only directed at what you care about, but where you're absolutely convinced that it's working, that's intoxicating, right? It's really hard to think anything other than that it is a privilege to be a part of that. And by the way, if you really can do that, and donors believe that you're doing it, they're going to recognize that you need to pay people reasonably, and you're not going to get people rich doing this. But if you say to your donors, look, I need people at this level, and I have to pay a bit more, and can you help me? They will, right? Because and I'm just going to add a thought about that. There is a way in which, how many people here have been involved in fundraising? Okay, so you guys know this. Some people who haven't been involved in fundraising, they sort of worry that it feels a bit undignified and you're kind of begging people and it's just uncomfortable. And I just want to urge us not to think that way. Because if you think about this from the perspective of people who have some money and they'd really like to do good in the world, it's actually a challenge for them to find the thing that's going to work. And what you're doing is you are offering them an opportunity to do something really special that they want to do. And so it's not for you, it's for the cause, which then gets me back to the idea that if part of that case is you understand what it's like to try to buy an apartment in Vancouver, you know what it costs, and I need people who can do work at the highest level, but they have to live somewhere, and can you help me, right? That's a pretty compelling case, and I can just think of lots of conversations where people say, yeah, my granddaughter is looking for an apartment, I can't believe what it costs, I totally know what you're saying, how much do you need, right? And that's good. But again, the point is if your heart is there and you want to do this, you can make it work.
My mind is still busy with the example that you said for the connection that you wanted to make between the donors and the senior people that you were trying to help. So I was wondering if you ever were able to make that connection, and how did you do that?
No, I mean, I believe it can be done. The thing I should say is I am a professor at Columbia Law School. Columbia was very generous to give me a few years away, and then they understandably said, no, it's time to come back if you want to come back. And I wanted to come back. So therefore I left before I ever had a chance to actually achieve that goal. We didn't achieve it. But I kind of go back in my head and think about the ways in which I could have been successful. And the thing I suppose I didn't say, which I want to emphasize, is how do you get buy-in? You get buy-in by including people in the decision. And so if it's a good idea and they're helping you come up with the idea, and with you, they've come to the conclusion that it is a good idea, they will give everything they have to make it successful. But if instead what happens is you say, this is what we're going to do, and they might smile, but in their head saying, who the heck are you to tell me to do that? And like, I didn't agree to do that, and so I'll just make some gesture in the direction of doing that, but I'm not really going to do it. Well, that's human nature, and the failure is you didn't include them. And the logistics being what they were, these people mostly didn't speak English. They were several thousand miles away from headquarters. We failed to find a way to include them so that they would see that it was a good idea, but that's the way we should have done it.
I also have just one more question, and is there any studies that have been done about the power of non-for-profits in kind of make you come over the dictatorship? Like, because I come from the country of Ahmadinejad, and
Yeah.
I know that so many people, we are just trying so hard to overcome that dictatorship, and I was just wondering that, is there some studies been done to prove that there's a power in that? Because it's a very complicated situation right now, and we're all just trying to see what are the ways that we can make the situation better.
Yeah, look, I wish I had a better answer for you. There is certain, like, within a society where people are allowed and even encouraged to organize, then of course nonprofits can be effective. But when you're operating in countries where that is frowned upon or even not legal, then it's a much more difficult thing. Now, the truth is, there was a lot of organizing in, Poland, for example, which is part of the reason why Poland, ahead of the rest of the Eastern Bloc, as we used to call it, got rid of their communist government, and then when it happened there. So there are experiences where this has worked. I will say about Iran, that I think there have been moments in recent years where countries like mine missed an opportunity to be more supportive. The Green Revolution, for example, like I breaks my heart that we couldn't and didn't do more, because people with such beautiful dreams didn't get to achieve what they wanted to achieve, and the whole world suffers as a result. So I think having partners outside the country can help too, but if you're asking me for a playbook, I wish I had it. I don't.
Wait.
Thank you, David. I found this presentation very charming. So you describe a world that actually few of us understand in a very accessible way. And I guess my question is, so asking behind the accessibility, there are two questions. One is, the way you presented the work of managing a nonprofit sounds perennial. I want to ask you, to what extent is your book addressing questions that would have been faced by nonprofits to a much lesser extent, let's say 40 years ago? So in the newspaper, we would read about how, let's say, the philanthropy sector is changing because, it's no longer the same people who are rich. There could be, there's a corporate responsibility movement. So all of that could be affecting the operation of nonprofits. So I wanted to ask which aspect of the book now you can say that is addressing that something that hasn't been present before. A second, maybe geekier question is, you're a scholar, and so as someone who cares a lot about the nonprofit sector, do you follow scholarship on nonprofits and say, done by economists or other scholars? Are there findings in that scholarship, in social science basically, that you think can inform the running of nonprofits?
Yeah, great questions. So one of my favorite insights comes from sociology, and you'll recognize it in the book as soon as I say it. There are sociologists who say, not about nonprofits, but about organizations generally, that they can never change. This is a strong claim. It's too strong. We observe change sometimes. But basically what they're saying is the following. They say, in order for any organization to function, it has to have a way of doing things, processes, procedures. If every morning Camden and Wei and I had to sit down and say, now, how should we do this legal education thing? Should we have classes? What should we teach? Like, we'd never get anything done. So every nonprofit, and indeed every for-profit company, even governments, they have a way of doing things. And one of the things that seems to happen is that with a successful organization, the people who use these processes think they're great. And maybe they are, but then the world changes. Maybe they're not as great as they used to be, but it seems like the last people to notice that are the people internal to the organization who are still using these processes. And so, the theory goes, the organization won't change, the world will change around it, other organizations will arise and take over their market share. And so there are academic insights that very much track the things that I say. My gloss on that is it's worse at nonprofits, because at least at a for-profit, you can say everything's fine, but you're losing money, people start noticing that, and at a for-profit, not necessarily. I do think a lot of the insights that I offer have been true for a while and will continue to be true for a while, but I will highlight something that I think has changed, and we haven't talked about it. At least in the United States, I think there's more polarization than there used to be. And this, at one level, can be not a benefit, but something nonprofits can navigate well, because you can choose which organization you want to support. And so we may all vote for the same government with different views about what it should be, but we don't have to do that at a nonprofit. Way you can choose one that matches your values, I can choose one that matches mine. So I think there's a way in which nonprofits are well suited to that, but there's also a problem. And the problem is that a lot of times nonprofits are supposed to focus on a mission. Let's say that mission is helping vulnerable populations. But then other people who care deeply about the nonprofit say, look at what's happened in the world. We should make a statement about that, and we should condemn it. And the problem is that the people who care about helping this vulnerable community of people might not all agree about whether that statement ought to be made. And in fact, they might have different views about it. And then, you've got your biggest donor calling you up and saying, if you don't make a statement, I'm leaving. And then your second biggest donor calls up and says, I hear you're thinking about making the statement. If you do, I'm leaving. And I do think there's an answer. And the answer is and it has to do with that third question, are we the right organization to do it? And the answer is, that's a really important point that you're making. And there are 6 different nonprofits that are actually about making that point, but it actually isn't us. So please understand, we have to focus on our mission and so on. But I think that problem wasn't as hard 20 years ago as it's become now.
So I think we have time for maybe one last question, if any.
Thank you for this wonderful talk. I just want to ask more about how do you evaluate an impact that an organization makes? For example, like in a profit-making world, we use share price and profits to measure success. But in terms of a nonprofit organization, could it be like responding to an issue promptly with X percentage of resources available? Thank you.
So there is, by definition, no one-size-fits-all answer, but there absolutely are things that you can do and really should do, and it's going to be very mission-specific. And so one insight that I'll share with you is if someone says, is it better to invest in basic scientific research or to help people who don't have enough to eat? I can't answer that question, right? Those comparisons are too different to do something meaningful. On the other hand, if you said to me, there are 4 different ways that we can try to help with food security, and here they are, well then actually I think we can do a pretty rigorous comparison of those different ones. And it would have to, we'd have to define what the goal was with precision, and then we'd have to talk about what it costs per person that we're helping. And it's really that kind of effort that I think is very powerful. But it does require you to sort of start by saying, we believe this goal is important. Remember my 3 questions. How important is the problem? We can use data to figure that out. I just can't use data to tell you that food insecurity is more important than vaccine research. Can't do that. But I can tell you that it is important, and once I do, then we can talk about alternative ways to try to advance the goal and compare them with costs, with data, and all the rest. And so I do talk a bit more about this in the book, but it is essential that we do that. And by the way, if you haven't picked up a copy, please take one. They're there for you.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Schizer. Why don't we give him another round of applause? And thank you, everyone, for attending.